Good evening. The Virginia Public Access Project and the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University welcome you to After Virginia Votes. Tonight, we take a deeper look at the 2025 elections in Virginia. This live broadcast is presented by Walmart and made possible by our sponsors: Innova, the Apartment and Office Building Association, Carillion Clinic, Centera, Town Bank, Jean Marie and Tom Davis, Nancy and Edward Rice, and viewers like you. Now, please welcome your host and moderator for this evening, NBC4 Northern Virginia Bureau Chief, Julie Carey.
Good evening and welcome to After Virginia Votes. My name is Julie Carey. I'm the Northern Virginia Bureau Chief for NBC4, and it is again my distinct privilege to moderate this unique event organized by the nonpartisan Virginia Public Access Project. The purpose of After Virginia Votes is to gain a deeper understanding of this year's elections in Virginia, to consider what those results mean for Virginia and what they might mean for the year ahead in Virginia politics. We'll focus most of our attention on the statewide races for governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general. We'll also look at those House of Delegates races. I'm going to be joined by two seasoned political professionals who will represent the two major political parties in this year's campaign. They've agreed to engage in a candid conversation in order to give us a behind-the-scenes look into the tactics deployed for these races. And then in the second part of the show, I'll be joined by Bob Holsworth and Mark Rozell, two of the most distinguished political analysts in Virginia. They're going to dissect the results and provide their insight on what this means for Virginia's political future. In each segment, we're going to be saving some time for questions that have been submitted in advance by people who are streaming online and by the small studio audience here. You can also weigh in on the conversation on X by using the hashtag AfterVAVotes. So before we get started, though, let's take a look at a handful of data visualizations prepared by VPAP. They'll help set the stage for the conversations ahead today. First up, we show a map of the change in party performance between the 2021 gubernatorial election and the 2025 election. As you can see, every single county and city in Virginia shifted its votes to a higher percentage for Democrats. Now, let's zoom in at Hampton Roads region to explain what we mean. In 2021, Governor Youngkin won Isle of Wight County by 29 percentage points. In 2025, Winsome Earl Sears won by 14 points, showing a big shift to the Democratic candidate by 15 points. Next, we look a little bit deeper into the representation of each party in the House of Delegates. Prior to last week's election, Democrats held a narrow majority in the House of Delegates, holding 51 seats, with Republicans holding 49. But when the General Assembly session begins in 2026, Democrats will hold 64 seats, and that's the most they've held since 1988. 12 Republican incumbents lost their seats in this year's elections, tying 2017 for the most incumbent losses since at least 1997. 2017, incidentally, also the first year of President Donald Trump's first term. Now let's do a quick dive into the funding for this year's elections in the race for governor. Abigail Spanberger maintained a significant advantage throughout the campaign, whereas in the Attorney General's race, incumbent Attorney General Jason Miyares enjoyed a slight advantage over challenger Jay Jones for the majority of the campaign, but then received a significant boost after October 3rd when a story was published revealing texts Jay Jones sent in 2022 to a colleague in the House of Delegates. Those texts showed Jones using violent language directed at the former Republican Speaker of the House. And finally, as I'm sure you know, Virginia allows for no excuse voting 45 days prior to the election. That article on the Jay Jones text was released on October 3rd, and by that time, over 360,000 votes had already been cast in the election. That's a look at our data. I'm now joined by our first panel. But first I want to tell you we had a last-minute change in our panel. Unfortunately, Mark Harris, who is the lead strategist at Cold Spark and a consultant for the Sears campaign, he was not able to join us as originally scheduled. But very happy to introduce in his place Scott Weldon. He is the founder of Carnitine Strategies and a consultant to Republican campaigns. And thanks so much for stepping in at the last minute, Scott. We really appreciate it. His counterpart here tonight, Samson Signori, he was a campaign manager for Abigail Spanberger for governor. Welcome to both of you to After Virginia Votes. Thanks so much for being here. I want to start by asking you both to just tell us a little bit briefly about your connection with the campaigns this year, and a little bit about your bio. Go ahead, Scott.
Sure. So I've been a political consultant here in Virginia for a little less than 20 years. I was the consultant on several of the House of Delegates races this cycle, and I work at the state and federal level.
And Samson, campaign manager, that part's obvious.
Yes.
But tell me about your day-to-day responsibilities.
Absolutely. And first, let me just say thanks a lot for having us, Julie, and thanks to VPAP for everything that you guys are putting together here. My name's Samson Signori. I've been involved in politics for the last 8 years, grew up here in Northern Virginia. I first started working for Abigail back in August of 2021 when I ran her congressional race. Moved over in 2023 to run the coordinated operation for the State House and State Senate. Came back and we launched the governor's race in late 2023. And I've been her campaign manager since.
Gotcha. Let me ask you both first, just to kind of give me your 30, 60-second takeaway on what we saw happen in Virginia. Really striking results. Samson, let me start with you.
Absolutely. So I think you saw Abigail Spanberger win because she was laser focused on lowering costs at a time when voters are tired of division and chaos, and frankly tired of having to pay attention to politics every single day. In Abigail Spanberger, they saw a candidate who was steady, who was steadfast, and who was laser focused on the issues that matter most to voters: lowering costs, boosting the economy, keeping our community safe. And that's why last Tuesday you didn't see just a landslide victory, but in my opinion, a coalition redefining victory. We won by over 15 points. That's the highest win since JFK was the president for a Democrat running for governor. And this was a coalition of working class voters who want to see lower costs. We saw boosted margins with African American, Hispanic, Asian American voters, and a huge swath of non-college white voters that were brought back into the fold too.
Scott, similar take?
Yeah, very similar. I would also point out that voters seem this year to be focused on cost of living and health care as much as any time in recent history. So I think, taking what Sam has said as well, I think all of that kind of coalesced behind also a kind of a weak candidate in Winsome and kind of a poorly run campaign to kind of give the victory that we saw last week. So.
I'm going to start digging deeper into some of these issues. Scott, let me start with you. I'm going to roll the tape back to April. And Republicans had, at that time, what seemed to maybe be an advantage for them. The whole ticket was set, no primary challenges. They had an opportunity to kind of hit the ground running, start on fundraising early. But then that story broke that Governor Youngkin wanted John Reed, the lieutenant governor nominee, to step out of the race. What kind of a hurdle right out of the box did that create for the campaign?
You know, I tend to think that it was more of a distraction than it was any sort of major impetus to success for the campaign. I think it became kind of a stumbling point, but nothing that kind of really impacted the effort as they were getting going. I think they were having trouble getting going to begin with, and I think that was just something that kind of was more of a distraction from the campaign that should have been up and running already.
Mm-hmm. Samson, I wanted to say, almost immediately after the primary for the Democrats, they had several rallies around the Commonwealth, appeared as a unified ticket. But it kind of seemed as the campaign went on, they pretty much were running their own races. I'm wondering how much conversation there was that went on between the three campaigns, and what kind of conversations were happening with those who were kind of orchestrating the House of Delegates races.
Yeah, so a lot of coordination up and down the ticket. This is my 8th cycle in Virginia, and I feel very confidently that this was the most coordinated that Democrats have ever been in the Commonwealth. We had weekly calls with the Attorney General and Lieutenant Governor campaigns, bi-weekly calls with the State House caucus. Very much unified on, and that's one of the reasons why immediately after the primary, we launched right into a statewide bus tour, and wanted to be sure that voters felt not just visually that Dems were unified, but really, taking that message statewide.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about message too in both campaigns. Samson, I talked to Abigail Spanberger early on in that bus tour, again at the end of the campaign. And it seems like her focus was essentially the same, talking about affordability and then, talking about pushing back against Trump policies that were so negatively impacting the federal workforce. What were your expectations back in the spring about whether she would be able to ride that message that way all the way to Election Day?
Absolutely. And I've worked for Abigail Spanberger for for many years. One of my favorite things about her is her attention and focus on message discipline and being relentlessly focused on the issues that matter most to everyday voters. I think we were laser focused on affordability and cost of living from the beginning to the end of this campaign. I think was one of the reasons we were so victorious. And you touched on implicating Trump a little bit as well. I think one thing we did correctly on our campaign is we didn't really focus on Trump. We focused on the consequences of Trump, not on his personality, but on his policies, specifically when they impacted voters' pocketbooks.
Scott, as I covered the Winsome Earl-Sears campaign, there seemed to be more fluctuations in message. Out of the box, there was a big splash with the car tax.
Yeah.
Later on came her, very determined attack on transgender student policies, and then towards the end of the campaign, talking more about energy policy, and then talking about Glenn Youngkin's economic success and the fact that she could be the torchbearer for that. I mean, how do you explain those fluctuations and how, perhaps damaging was that to her in trying to convey her message to voters?
I mean, as you look kind of from the beginning of the campaign on, there was really no clear message. You had, to your point, several different iterations. I think, you also have to take into consideration that there were some changes in staff during the campaign as well. So, I think when Mark and the Cold Spark guys kind of got involved, they kind of wanted to get back to looking at the data, what's driving voters, what can we use to move the needle. I assume what they were looking at was whether they had issues motivating the base or whether they had issues trying to persuade the persuadables in the middle. They were trying to find the message that was selling. And I think that, when we look back on it, it kind of, they had a similar ad to what Donald Trump ran last year that I think kind of fell flat on the they-them towards the end of the campaign. And I think they stayed on that message for about a month. Similar on the bathroom issue, which I think was kind of one of the things where Abigail was head and shoulders kind of above on, where you had a laser focus on cost of living, health care, issues that were really percolating in people's minds, especially up here in Northern Virginia. We had a government shutdown in the midst as well. So trying to stay on message, I think was difficult, but I think they were trying to track where the data was driving them, where they needed to push it. But I think it was, I think the up and down of the messaging was just indicative of what the campaign was dealing with.
A quick follow-up to that. Was it your sense early on that they would need to motivate the base? Why was that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a little bit of, Donald Trump never gave a full-throated endorsement. The Republican Party has become the party of low propensity turnout. And the higher the turnout becomes, the better Republican Party does. So in this instance where you have kind of an unmotivated, low propensity Republican base, you've got to find a way to motivate them to show up. And I think it was in terms of the message they were putting out, that trying to emulate some of the messaging that Donald Trump did. But as we've kind of learned, Donald Trump's the only person that can do that. And I think this was kind of one of the lessons that you watched kind of as they continue to push those messages out.
Both campaigns obviously had to talk about how to deal with Donald Trump, and I'm wondering for Republican candidates and Winsome Earl-Sears in particular, at the outset there was definitely some resentment because of her statement a few years back that she didn't think Donald Trump should run for a third term. She did a complete about face in the campaign and pretty much fully embraced his policies. Did she have any other choice, knowing again the kind of pain some Virginians were suffering and how they were viewing the president as this campaign went on?
I think it was hard for her because she had to balance. I'm seeing this in the data. I'm seeing the polling. I'm seeing what's happening at the federal level in Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads, where it's very federally dependent. And then I've got to put out a message that resonates to the base. And I think trying to walk that tightrope is very difficult, especially in this environment where, if you're not in full alignment with Trump, it can be damaging to the base. So I think that was something that she struggled with kind of as she continued through this campaign. And I think it was something that we know that the data showed it.
Yeah. Samson, you talked about it a little bit a minute ago about the fact that Abigail Spanberger talked more about the impact of the policies than she did the president himself. But how much of your strategy was kind of dependent on the fact that voters, anyway, would be casting their ballots, seeing this as their referendum on Donald Trump?
Well, I think this is an election built and driven by life being too expensive, and voters wanting a return to normalcy and a return to the basics. And from our perspective, we would invoke Trump and speak out against Trump, whenever he did anything that impacted Virginians' daily lives. DOGE, federal workforce cuts, especially hitting Northern Virginia and Hampton roads. The gutting of healthcare, which drove up premiums for Virginians and also closed, I think it's 3 rural health clinics out in Southwest during this year. So for us, it was really any time that Trump was affecting Virginians' pocketbooks was the time that we were going to speak out against the consequences of him.
You referenced it, Scott, a few minutes ago. There was a little bit of a reboot in the Winsome Earl-Sears campaign midsummer. A couple of reboots. But the campaign manager was reassigned. The political director left. Mark Harris kind of took a more direct role in the campaign at that point. And on a conference call with reporters at that time, he expressed optimism and pointed out that their internal polling showed that Winsome Earl-Sears was in a better position at that point in July than Glenn Youngkin had been in 2021. So why was she unable to recreate that coalition that helped Glenn Youngkin?
I mean,
win?
I would also just discuss, I think it's a larger question of, was the polling accurate? You know, when we look at methodology and even all the internals that we had for my clients significantly underestimated the turnout models for how Democrats were going to show up, how enthused they were. So I think, yes, I take into consideration that they probably were looking at data that was, even at the time, maybe there was still a block of undecided voters, maybe some persuadable voters that they felt good about, but I also would question that the methodology on the polling and the data coming back, especially with what we saw last week, I think it skewed a lot of data on what was coming back to campaigns and what the polling actually looked like versus what the electorate was going to look like on Election Day.
Samson, you referenced a coalition readjustment that you think went on in the Spanberger race. What kind of coalition were you aiming to build, and what it ended up consisting of, and how did turnout factor into that?
Yeah, so Abigail is the type of candidate who wants to go after all voters, right? There's a lot of Democrats that look at, what voters are possible, segmenting and splitting up different voter and different voter groups. When we looked at the Commonwealth, we wanted to look at every single voter. And for us, our coalition was regardless of who you are, it's voters who want lower costs and voters who want steady, pragmatic leadership. And what we saw from our coalition was we saw increased turnout and support from African American, Hispanic, and Asian American voters. In fact, if you go and you look at the overperformance compared to 2024, the precincts in the counties that we had the highest overperformance in compared to 2024 were also the precincts and counties that have the highest population of Latino voters. We also saw multiple counties that went for Trump 3 times in his presidential run. 2016, Donald Trump, 2020, Donald Trump, 2024, Donald Trump, 2025, Abigail Spanberger. And I think we just added a couple more counties to that role today as provisionals continue to come back in. So our coalition was made up of mainly working class folks who want a steady, pragmatic leadership and lower costs.
And you didn't leave the rural areas untouched.
No.
You didn't exclude them from your coalition.
Absolutely not. And this is something that's always been true to who Abigail is as a candidate, and also her style of campaigning and the way that she reaches out to voters. We visited counties that Democrats have not been to in years. Just a couple weeks prior to the election, we were out in Lee County, which is the westernmost county. Fun fact, it's even to the further west than Detroit. But we had our bus tour, and our bus tour, our halfway point was in Lee County. And Abigail spent a lot of time, and in my opinion, far more time than your typical Democrat does, meeting with voters directly in their communities. And when we mean statewide, we mean statewide. And that also, of course, included more rural communities.
Would you make the argument, though, now that this is a coalition that can last or is more born of the circumstances that we're in?
I think if it's a coalition that is headed up by people like Abigail Spanberger, focused, pragmatic, steady leaders who are focused on the issues that matter most to Virginians, if that's the kind of leadership and the kind of example that's at the forefront of our politics, I absolutely think that's a coalition that can last.
I want to talk about something that was a big issue in the 2021 campaign, and that's parents' rights, and really explore how much that still matters. Obviously, not as much in this election as it did. But, Scott, in 2021, COVID still fresh in everybody's minds, and Glenn Youngkin took that Parents Matter mantra and rode that to victory. The Earl Sears campaign clearly thought that message would still resonate with voters, but she seemed to focus more squarely and narrowly on transgender student policy. You've sort of spoken to it a bit already, but was her campaign too reliant on that, talking about that too much at the expense of talking to other things that were more on voters' minds? And just one more thing I'll throw in there. Some of the polling that was done about the issues that were important to voters, it polled at 3%.
Yeah.
As contrasted to, inflation and the economy that were always up at the top of the list.
I actually, in defense of Winsome on this, I think one of her best commercials was the parental rights ads that she put out with the woman face to camera, testimonial ad. It was one of the best, pieces of media that she did the entire campaign. That being said, I also think that there was a misplaced kind of focus where the entire energy of your campaign could have been and should have been focused on the issues that matter to voters. That's your pocketbook. That's, and we saw a big spike in polling when One Big Beautiful Bill was up because people started getting concerned about health care. That became a large concern, I think, as voters kind of started looking at some of what was happening. And they looked at it and I think the media and advertising that was put out could have mirrored that and reflected that in a way that I think would have moved the needle maybe a little bit more. But I also think it was kind of, as they're trying to cauterize the wounds, how do you get to the right message? I think that on the parental rights, I think it's obviously still going to be an important issue, but it's also kind of one of those things where we look at this and we say, I think the public generally, if they agree with Republicans on this issue, they know that we're going to be with them. Mm-hmm. They know if they need if something flares up on an issue, they don't need to go and tell voters that. We don't need to relitigate the 2021 campaign again or anything out, 2024. You're in a new environment. You need to kind of adapt to it, and I think that's kind of one of the messages and takeaways that I would have right now for that.
Samson, it does seem, though, like Winsome Earl Sears' intense focus on that issue through the campaign did push Abigail Spanberger to be a little more specific in how she articulated her position. I mean, at the outset, in the ad, she emphasized the fact that she was a mom of 3 girls and, wanted school safety. And I think by the time the debate rolled around, she was a little more specific in her answer, not only there, but, when reporters pressed her on it. But how was she then? I mean, she was able to fend off the, she's for they, them, that, so her Kamala Harris, and there were millions of dollars of ads spent against her on that issue. So why do you think she was able to overcome that?
Yeah, so I'll start with saying I think Abigail was always consistent on where she stood on this issue from the beginning of the campaign to the end. I believe that the Sears campaign and Republicans broadly got way ahead of their skis on culture war issues. They ran campaigns relentlessly obsessively focused on culture wars, entirely devoid of any economic argument and any argument about how they're going to make lives truly better for Virginians. But we knew that Sears and her campaign were going to run these culture war, gender-issued style attack ads on Abigail, and we had multiple ads cut, ad tested, ready to go. And I think that first attack ad that you saw the GOP put out, we had a response up in about 2 hours. And we also spent a lot of time early on in the campaign making sure that we were credentialing Abigail and telling voters exactly what she was focused on. It's part of the reason that we made a decision to start our paid media campaign much earlier than most campaigns do, partially driven by the fact that Abigail had advertised in Richmond and the D.C. media market before from her congressional districts, but we knew we needed to expand outwards into Southwest and into Hampton Roads, but also because we knew that the GOP the Republican opponent was going to come after and try to smear us specifically on the culture war issues. So we laid down a solid foundation that Abigail is a former federal law enforcement officer, former CA case officer, mother to 3 girls who was relentlessly focused on lowering costs and making our communities safe. So I think that when Sears rolled out those culture war ads, they largely fell on deaf ears.
Let's talk about the October surprise, as some call it. The revelation of those J. Jones text messages, and just days before the first gubernatorial debate. Scott, this is a question I haven't heard answered. Maybe you can. Do you have any insight as to why Republicans waited until after early voting started to drop that bombshell?
I think there was a strategic decision made, and whether you can agree or disagree, I think there needed. There's no, it absolutely enthused at least the Miera's and Republican ticket for the first time, really in the entire campaign. So, you could argue maybe they should have dropped it right before early voting. Would that have done enough? I would probably say probably not, considering the motivated voters probably were pretty set in their ways on who they were voting for, and considering what the electorate looked on Election Day. But I would say, do you push it closer to Election Day so that message stays? I think they made the kind of strategic decision that those messages were going to be released to try and maximize the length that they could keep that message moving. But obviously that's a decision that the Miera's campaign and the party made, and I think it was, like I said, the first time that the ticket really had some enthusiasm behind it, whether it was anti-Jones, because even if you saw the Winsome campaign shifted their messaging not against Abigail anymore, that wasn't working as well, so they shifted more on the J. Jones message and a couple other ancillary pieces around that. So I think when they make the decision to put that out there, I think they were trying to kind of keep it running as long as they could through Election Day, but that's just my opinion.
I'll press the question a little farther,
Sure.
just because of my curiosity.
Yeah.
How widely known was it that something was coming?
Even to me and to most people out there, I don't think many people knew. I think there were people that were, would say, oh yeah, there's always an October surprise, to campaign. Whether that's impactful or not is another question. I think this was, I don't think many people knew that this was coming.
Samson, at that stage of the campaign, with the fundraising position you were in, with the polling that you were in, your campaign had to be feeling, pretty darn comfortable. But how much did the emergence of that text scandal kind of jolt the campaign a little bit, or cause, any kind of ripple?
Yeah, so by and large, from the time that the scandal came out to the end of the campaign, we saw very little movement internally on our end, just from a polling perspective. We obviously, look, the text, Jay's a friend. I ran his AG race back in 2021. The texts were pretty abhorrent. I think everybody would agree to that. And him and Abigail had a conversation the day that they came out. We released a statement later that day. I think we called him disgusting. And ultimately, we wanted to be sure that he apologized and made right, not just with political leadership, but also with voters. And I think 2 weeks after that, they had their debate where he apologized, which I think is something that you rarely see politicians do very often. He went out and he apologized, and he deeply meant it. And on Tuesday, he was elected.
It took a little while for him to do a public, on-the-air apology. There was a written statement fairly early on, but did your campaign try to influence that at all? Did you give any guidance there about how he should approach it?
So the first conversation that they had and our campaign had with them was that we felt that the texts were really bad, and we asked that they apologize. I wasn't involved with much internal deliberations outside of that, but I know that I think before the end of the day, they had put out an apology and done something on air around it as well.
So I'm sure everybody anticipated that would be a big topic at that debate, and I think in my script that night I described that gubernatorial debate as unlike any I've ever watched. Scott, let me start with you. What did you make of Winsome Earle-Sears? It was obvious strategy, that unusual approach of interrupting not only her opponent, but the moderators to hammer away at the J. Jones texts, and the Republicans demand that Democrats and Abigail Spanberger call on him to drop out of the race. What did you think of that?
I think to the public watching it, it was not something that was appealing to anybody. To many people watching it, I don't think they appreciated that tactic. I don't think it was good, but it gave Winsome the best, I think, ad that she had the entire campaign. So when she put out the question of her kind of pointing at the camera and talking to Abigail, I think that was probably one of her most potent advertisings. But I don't think the tactic itself is very impactful or helpful. I think we've seen that in a couple debates before, and the public doesn't walk away from that feeling good about how that went down. So I think that it was really whether it was intentional or not, I think it was created to have some sound bites pulled from it and some media clips made from it.
Samson, the text message must have altered debate prep a little bit. I mean, what was the plan for dealing with that?
A little bit, but look, our position didn't waver, right? We wanted to be sure that voters had their opportunity to make their choice, and also for the Jones campaign to have the ability to make right with voters, which they obviously did. So it didn't impact. I mean, we were prepared to answer the question in the debate. We also did during our debate prepare for a lot of interrupting. So I think that the debate prep that we did ended up bearing out in reality. Yeah.
That begs a question, though. I mean, had you decided that she would not engage then? Because that was, that did create the moment for the ad, the fact that Abigail Spanberger did not respond and hardly even looked at her. Was that part of your strategy?
Our strategy was that if our opponent was going to be disrespectful on the debate stage and interrupt or do anything of the sort, that we wouldn't follow her down that path. And we wanted to have a debate that was focused solely on the issues, focused on lowering costs, focus on turning down the temperature on politics a little bit. And we came and wanted to have that debate, and we wanted to be sure that we were laser focused on the actual issues there.
Any regrets after seeing that ad that it generated?
No, we did some ad testing with that ad too. Like most of the ads that Sears put out, it was not very effective in our opinion.
You mentioned that ad already. Both campaigns kind of had a little bit of video gold to work with. That it seems like was Winsome Earl-Sears' strongest piece of video that she was able to gather. But was it worth what she sacrificed in that debate? That's the question.
Last Tuesday is a pretty good indication of that.
Yeah. And Samson, your campaign, it was I Am Speaking from Winsome Earl-Sears' Labor Day speech that she gave down in Southwest Virginia. It was used in multiple ads in different ways. Did you ever worry that voters would kind of start to tire of it?
If a voter begins to tire of it, that's right when our message is breaking through, in our opinion.
True.
But look, one of the things that I was really proud of with that specific ad, and this was part of the strategy that we put together, is we wanted to make something that not only resonated and became thematic in the paid media capacity, but could also expand outside of just paid media into social media and kind of into political culture in Virginia. And you saw that with this ad on TikTok, on Instagram, on a lot of social media sites. You had content creators, influencers, comedians even take that I Am Speaking tagline that we ran on TV ads and sort of do their own bits on it in social media. And I think that was a goal of ours that we set out for, and we saw that play out.
Yeah. The other thing that, aside from the J. Jones text, that was mostly unexpected, that was the government shutdown. Big impact later in this campaign too. Scott, that had to feel like a gut punch to not only the Winsome Earl-Sears campaign, but other Republican campaigns. Just yet another reminder of the difficulty.
No question. I mean, especially when you're talking about Northern Virginia, Hampton Roads, a lot of civilian contractors, federal employees, a lot of people impacted by that. And not only that, they get to sit at home and watch the ads, see everything going on, see look at their bank accounts, look in their the cost of their health care, everything that kind of helped drive, I think, turnout and depressed turnout for Republicans kind of is a little bit, it's all part and parcel with kind of what happened during the kind of dysfunctional Washington, D.C. process of dealing with the shutdown. And I think that just continued to drive and pile up on the numbers, and it definitely was not helpful, that's for sure.
And in your campaign, it was just something you could kind of seamlessly roll in, right?
Well, I think for our campaign, it was proof of the exact argument that we made, which is chaos and political division and dysfunction is driving up costs and hurting the economy for typical Virginians. So for us, the government shutdown was unfortunately proof of the exact problem that we were trying to highlight and talk about in our campaign.
I want to ask a couple of somewhat self-interested questions. But I wasn't the only journalist during this cycle that was grumbling a little bit about candidate access. But I want to start first by asking about debates. Only one debate. I mean, traditionally in Virginia, 2 or 3 gubernatorial debates. How do you explain the fact that candidates seem to be more reluctant, rather, to schedule debates? Scott, you want to start?
I mean, I'm going to steal a quote from somebody. It's like, never speak unless it improves the sound of silence. and I think that there's a piece of this that's very, we'll call it the risk reward. Is it worth putting yourself out there to have an issue like President Biden did last year? Multiple other candidates, the risk of being out in front of a camera, in front of an audience, in front of people that puts you, whether, and honestly, especially with, what we saw in the Charlie Kirk shooting, I think there's a lot of, fear in candidates, and there's death threats and everything out there. So I think you take the two things out there that people are seeing from a high level, whether it's, it's the risk reward. So I think they look at this as, is it worth being out there politically? And then do I feel safe being there as well? So from a media perspective, obviously, that was the risk reward of the political campaign. But yeah, I think that's the calculus that kind of goes into some of that decision making.
Is there a sense that voters don't need it, don't want it, aren't demanding it, or what do you think is influencing that?
So we would have been happy to do more debates. In fact, I believe we agreed to one or two additional ones on top of the one that we did that our opponent did not agree to. We've always felt strongly in doing debates and making sure that those are honed in and focused on the issues. I think there was one really interesting piece of data around the debate that we did have, and that is when we poll, we ask open-ended questions, right? What are you hearing? What are you seeing about these two candidates or about politics in Virginia? And overwhelmingly in the weeks leading after that debate, there was a lot of Virginians that had tuned into and had some awareness around the debate, mainly around our opponent's behavior during the debate. But I think it's clear that there were Virginians who were tuning into it, and we wish that we had done more.
Yeah, and I guess the other part of my question is just, the media, I think, has less access than we used to. I mean, there was a time when we can all remember almost after every public event, there'd be a gaggle and, questions on the fly. I'm seeing less and less of that. And I'm wondering whether part of it has to do with security, is part of it wanting to avoid unscripted moments? What's factoring into that?
I think that's definitely some of it, but I also think, when you have the ability to, have a paid media campaign and an operation that can be successful that way, I think they know they can reach voters in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different capacities. But, I'm a believer in traditional media being a big component of every campaign. I think you should be talking to as many people as you can, reporters, and giving your side of the story, letting them hear it. And I mean, there's nothing worse I like seeing than it could not be reached for comment. So that's just the way I see it. But I also know that, a lot of people out there, again, put themselves up versus that risk reward. Is it worth, speaking when it doesn't improve the sound of silence?
Happy to hear that. I endorse that. How about you, Samson? I mean, what do you think? I mean, I think there was less access, fewer free-for-alls with reporters.
I feel that the campaign was available to reporters throughout the course of the cycle. We had press gaggles, whether it be at campaign stops, at bus tours, et cetera. I think when you look at campaigns and press access, you also have to compare it to the opponent. And I think that on the opponent's side, there was very few, if any, local Virginia press access.
How much greater consideration, though, is security now? Much greater.
Much greater. I mean, speaking frankly, there's been heinous acts of political violence earlier this year. It's a serious thing that campaign staff and candidates have to think about, and it's unfortunately the world that we live in.
The next thing I want to ask about, it's usually something I reserve for the second panel, but I really want to hear from both of you, and that is the guidance and advice that you have for the campaigns that are right around the corner in 2026, based on what we saw in Virginia. Scott, let me start with you.
I've got a couple of clients. Hopefully they're watching. I would say you've got to get back to the basics of what's driving the electorate. It is kitchen table issues, plain and simple. Cost of living. When I look back and we look at the message that we were pushing out, and yes, we can get into some and hit on the ancillary on the sides and edges on some of these culture issues if they're doing well. But at the end of the day, voters want to know that you're looking out for their pocketbook. We can talk about all these bills that have been passed and everything, but until it's actually felt in your pocketbook that you feel you have more money, then I think voters will continue to be skeptical of candidates that are not focused on that.
Samson, for you, just going to say follow our lead?
Follow the lead of Abigail Spanberger. No, I think that voters want to return to basics. Voters want the temperature turned down on politics. Voters want a return to normalcy. They want pragmatic, steady, focused leadership on the issues that matter most to them, lowering costs and keeping communities safe. I think, and to speak specifically to Democrats here for a second, I think one thing that Abigail Spanberger did tremendously well is message discipline from the beginning to the end of the campaign. Oftentimes, Democratic campaigns get caught up in what I call sort of the grab bag of progressive issues. And for Abigail Spanberger, it was lowering costs and strengthening the economy and keeping communities safe from the start to the beginning, from the start to the end. And I think that that message discipline is something to be modeled.
Of course, the next electoral test is not the midterms, but it could be this vote on redistricting, on the constitutional amendment. You know, if Democrats follow the plan that they have right now, there'll be a vote early in the session, could go to the voters in the spring. Scott, is that a chance for Republicans to kind of regain some of their footing?
I think so. I mean, again,
and how so?
I think, looking at what happened last Tuesday and then looking forward to what may happen, there's a lot of time. I mean, we've seen a little bit of fracturing in the Democrat Party as of late with some of what happened with the government shutdown and several of the votes to kind of reopen. So I think there's ample opportunity to kind of build the right message in a fundraising apparatus to build a campaign around, rebuilding the seats outside of what we put in place, which was an independent, bipartisan redistricting committee. So I think there's plenty of time to kind of track where the message is going and what that looks like, and to build an organization and a campaign to push back against that.
Mm-hmm. And Samson, for Democrats, who are going to be potentially pushing this, if they keep to plan, I mean, what's the chance that voters will kind of start to reject the idea and sour a little bit? If they do think back to the fact that, hey, we just voted on this a few years ago, we thought we were getting fairer maps. I mean, do Democrats have something to worry about in pushing the redistricting constitutional amendment?
So I've been laser focused on just this past Tuesday, so I can't say I've done a whole lot of analysis into anything beyond. But look, I know Dems in the State House and Senate wanted to preserve optionality. So they took that vote before the Tuesday election. I've been in close touch with a lot of the leadership in the House and Senate to sort of see how things come together. I think there's more information to come, and we'll have to see.
Mm-hmm. Any surprises for either of you? And I'm not talking about the J. Jones tax or anything like that. You mentioned something in a panel recently about an AI phenomena that popped up. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this was the question that I was answering on that was Crooked Cotton Pod Save America panel was what scares me about the future of politics. And for us, or for me at least, one of the scariest moments that we had on the campaign was that there was an AI video put out from the conservative social media ecosphere. And it was meant to look like a campaign ad that our campaign had put out. And apparently it looked just real enough that it got a lot of Democrats buzzed up. We got calls from a lot of political consultants, political operatives saying, "What kind of ad did you guys just put out?" And us having to say, "No, this is AI. This was not us. This was from the conservative ecosphere." And the other thing that was worrisome about it is, on X they've got the @Grok, Grok, the AI bot that you can tag in tweets and it'll tell you some information about it. And someone had said @Grok, "Is this really a Spanberger campaign ad?" And Grok had come back and said, "Yes, this is a campaign ad." And that was not the case at all. So that was something that was really worrisome to us, mainly just because of the lack of control on our end. What we can do is we can flag it for X, we can flag it for operatives who call us and ask if it was a real ad. But ultimately, I think this is something that needs some policy change. It's also something that campaigns on both sides of the aisle are going to need to be armed and prepared for into the future.
Scott, anything for you in that arena?
Not necessarily. Not that I would say, this was a slow-moving train that we all saw coming.
Yeah. And last question for both of you, is Virginia blue?
Yes.
Yes.
I think Virginia has been and remains to be purple.
Okay. Explain that a little bit further. Because so many analysts in the wake of this are just, saying, yep, it's blue again.
I mean, look, I think...
Not a battleground.
Yeah. People back in 2017 said, Virginia is solidly blue. And I think that Virginians are inherently independent-minded. They are inherently voters who pay close attention to their politicians and what issues they're focused on. And I think that look, we were the only race in the nation to actually flip a seat from red to blue on Tuesday nationwide. And I think that this remains a battleground state, one that Abigail Spanberger just won quite handily.
Great conversation. Thanks so much to both of you, Scott Weldon, especially for jumping in at the last minute.
I'm done speaking.
You've been waiting for that one. Samson, Signori, thank you very much to both of you, and we'll be back in just a few moments with our top-notch political analysts.
American-made tour? Follow me. Over 2/3 of what Walmart buys is American-made. There's healthy dried fruit from California, clothing sewn in North Carolina, and jams from right down the street. And when Walmart buys from American companies, that helps those companies grow.
We've doubled our Walmart business.
And hired more folks.
Well, I guess you could say you're doing just peachy.
Oh, wow.
You get it?
The Virginia Public Access Project is critical to providing information to the general public about what's happening in Virginia state and local politics and government.
Anyone of any age can come to vpap.org and find this sense of calm and clarity and access this information that they didn't know before.
VPAP is here to be a resource for people that want to participate in their government.
It takes data from politics all around the country and in our Commonwealth, bringing you the news, legislation, and bills all in an easy to digest package. They're vetting the information, so I know this is truthful, I know this is real.
It's not trying to sway you. It's a tool to ensure that people be informed, and we're just providing the information and the facts from which then people can start to have conversations about what it means to them.
VPAP has almost 30 years of experience providing nonpartisan political information, so you can feel confident that you can use our resources and share that you're using them because it's coming from a reliable source.
Today, Greg is a market manager at Walmart, overseeing 10 Walmart stores. But 18 years ago, he was just getting his start as an hourly associate.
I've heard so many promotions, I've honestly lost count.
And is earning an education tuition-free.
I'm always trying to learn new things and better myself.
He's also bought his dream house, raised 4 kids, and became a Pee Wee football coach.
Go Vikings! I've reached milestones at Walmart that I've never ever thought I would.
Welcome back. I'm now joined by our 2 distinguished political commentators. We'll be discussing the results and what they mean for Virginia in the coming year. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Robert Holsworth. He is the founding director of the Center for Public Policy at the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at Virginia Commonwealth University. And Dr. Mark Rozell, he is the dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. Thanks for being here. You guys always have such great insights, and I don't know 2 people who follow Virginia politics more closely and have for a little while, just like I have. So we're veterans, right? I like that word. Let me start just, as I did with the first panel, your 30 to 60 second takeaway on what we saw happen. Mark?
Yeah, I don't think it was a fundamental change in Virginia politics. The last question on the previous panel was whether Virginia is blue or purple. I think we still are a competitive 2-party state. Considering the historic pattern of Virginia elections where the party in the White House almost always loses the governorship the next year, Donald Trump in the White House, the DOJ cuts, attacks on the federal government, the impact on the regional economy in Northern Virginia in particular. I just think so many things were aligned against the Republican campaign that I would caution that one not read too much into these results as in some way indicating a fundamental partisan shift to the Democratic Party that's going to be long-lasting.
Bob, agree or disagree?
Well, I agree with that. I think one point I would make is that this was a national election in many ways. Donald Trump takes all the political oxygen. His numbers were way down nationally. He was minus 15 in Virginia. You saw national results in which the Democratic candidate and Trump's disapproval rating, sort of were just congruent all the time. So I think that was the sort of the water or the framework of the environment in which this election took place. Not to diminish or take anything away from the kind of campaign that Abigail Spanberger ran, but by and large, we saw so many accounts of reporters who went out, national reporters who went out across Virginia, and what they heard was not really about Abigail Spanberger's pragmatism or Abigail Spanberger is going to lower costs. They were there to make a statement about Donald Trump, and they made it.
Yeah, and I certainly heard that echoed in many of the voters I spoke to, especially the early voters. They wouldn't even mention the candidate's name sometimes, not even at the top of the ticket, but they would talk about Donald Trump, and that was the sole reason they were casting their vote. So we heard Samson just talk about how he thinks this is a coalition readjustment, though, that it is something major in Virginia, what Abigail Spanberger was planning to do. Do you think he's accurate on that, or is that kind of an overstatement, again, given what you just said about the climate we were in?
Yeah, I think it's an overstatement. Certainly Virginia has trended increasingly blue, but as the 2021 election shows, Virginia can flip red under the right circumstances. And so it is quite possible we can end up with another competitive gubernatorial election in 4 years. And go red again. So I don't want to read too much into it. And I think if you're looking at coalitional change, let's think about next year's elections and what happens in the midterms. And maybe that will be a little bit more telling as to whether this is part of a trend over time. But I would not read too much into one election cycle.
But Bob, did it start to reshape the Democrats' coalition compared to where they were?
I think only a little bit, actually, because I think what you saw was that there was certainly an expansion in Northern Virginia, where Donald Trump had done a little better, particularly with Latino voters, and that just evaporated, largely because of an issue that Abigail Spanberger hardly touched on, which was deportation and the response to that. So you saw that in Northern Virginia. There was an exaggeration before about how well she did in the Southwest Virginia. She ran behind Tim Kaine in all of those things. She was not the only candidate to ever go there. But she ran very, very well in the African American community. And I'm not sure that's necessarily because of Abigail Spanberger. I think it's largely because of Donald Trump. And I might add the enormous job that Speaker Don Scott did in raising money and turning out voters in these competitive, 13 competitive seats that the Democrats targeted. That was just, I think, a phenomenal job that was done there. So there was a good, I think, coordination between Spanberger and the Democrats in the House, but I wouldn't minimize how successful the Democrats were in mobilizing voters in those competitive House districts as well.
And we'll talk about some of how this impacts the future, but I want to kind of stay on what happened in the election. Donald Trump's been on the ballot 3 times in Virginia, but did he perhaps have his biggest impact this time when he wasn't on the ballot?
Well, let me just say that it's the same thing happened in 2017. The top of the ticket didn't win by as much. Northern won by 9, Spanberger won by a little 15 plus, but the House of Delegates were the same. The Democrats took 15 seats in 2017, probably easier terrain because they only had 34. But in the 8 years of Donald Trump, the Republicans have gone from 66 seats in the House to 36. That's in part because of the great job I think some of the Democrats are doing, but in part because people are making a statement about Donald Trump.
Yeah, Mark, want to weigh in on that?
I think that's right.
Yeah. So let's talk about Jay Jones, and I'm going to ask you kind of some different questions about that. How surprised were either of you that he survived a scandal that voters not only in polling said they were well aware of? It was something like 80% of voters knew of that scandal, and they, roundly condemned it. Surprised he was able to survive, or was it only because of that incredible margin?
Right. The top of the ticket winning by more than 15 percentage points, and Jones won by about 5, so he still ran 10 points below the top of the ticket, which is significant. But by most standards, that's a comfortable win. He was carried over the finish line by a huge Democratic majority at the top of the ticket, no doubt about it. I think it was a coattails effect more than anything. So I wasn't terribly surprised given the fact that it was such a blowout election in that regard. And also I think voters have become a little bit immune to scandal. Think about 19 years ago, one word ended George Allen's political career. 10 years after that, the Access Hollywood tapes, right? Last year, Mr. Trump gets elected a second time after 2 impeachments, the Stormy Daniels hush money case, the sexual harassment findings against him. So maybe people just don't feel that same sense of scandal impacting their voting decisions. And I would add to that, too, that perhaps many voters toward the end considered what's more important, what he did 2 years ago, and I'm not minimizing it, it was really bad, or what are going to be the impacts on public policy over the next 4 years, depending upon which of these 2 men happens to hold the position of Attorney General. And a rational voter, I think, could easily make that calculation and say, there's something much bigger at play here than this one really bad thing, but it doesn't outweigh the importance of that job and what the next Attorney General is going to be doing.
Bob, you and I talked the day of the Attorney General's debate, and I was asking you, how you thought voters would respond, whether we'd see ticket splitting, whether voters that had planned to vote a straight Democratic ticket would split their ticket to sort of show their condemnation for what he said. You said, that it would be more that an undervote would be more likely. You were proven right in that. But how do you analyze, how voters ended up casting their ballots?
I'm not so sure I was right about the undervote, but here's what I think. I think what happened is that some independents split their vote. I don't think too many Democrats did. If you look at the what happened is that almost all around in the larger jurisdictions, he ran 5 or 6 percentage points behind Spanberger. In the districts that were primarily African American, he ran 3 percentage points. Interestingly enough, in the small rural localities, he also ran 3 percentage points behind Spanberger because the Democrats get no votes whatsoever there. So where they were getting 18%, he got 15. It didn't go down to 10 or something like that. So that happened. The undervote actually was about only 1.3%. And that is a little larger than we've seen in the last 2 elections, but not as large as we've seen in some others. And at the end of the day, I would echo Mark. I think that people have become somewhat jaded about scandal. Some of us remember a long time ago, 40 years ago, when there was a Republican Attorney General candidate who enhanced his resume about playing for the Washington football team. Said he had played when he'd really been only on the practice squad. And that was just totally disqualifying. We've come a long way.
I would never accept that.
Just real briefly, I want to explore a different angle of the J. Jones text scandal, and that is, does it, for those who would like to tighten Virginia's early voting rules, does it prompt any rethinking of that or sort of play into that narrative? The fact that almost 400,000 voters cast their ballots before they even knew about this?
Okay, General Assembly, put an end to this. That's my take. 45 days before Election Day is too long. It really is for early voting. At least shorten the period of time. October surprises have become the norm. They're not the exception anymore. And I can tell you how many people who said, I think I'd take my vote back if I knew this before. So I don't know, 45 days before Election Day is too much. We make voting way too easily in this country, and shorten the period of time.
Yeah, Bob, we're not likely to see that with the Democratic General Assembly, but what do you think?
I like
Well,
the
they're not
fact
gonna
that,
do
I like
it,
the
right.
fact that we've made voting a lot easier, actually, overall. I think that's a good thing, not a bad thing. At the same time, we should do some analysis of, well, how many people vote 45 days out,
Right.
and would we really lose anything if we went to 30 days? But the fact of the matter is that I think we've increased participation somewhat, not tremendously, but we're now getting over 50% of people voting in gubernatorial elections, 50% of the registered voters, something that didn't happen for many years. So I think that's a good thing, not a bad thing. But it might have had a minimal impact here. I don't think it was going to change an election where Jay Jones at the end won by 6 points.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to ask you two both about your observations regarding campaign style and the way that these statewide candidates are handling both, debates and then just also their access that they're giving to the media, in the more unscripted kinds of question and answer sessions. I mean, have we seen a change there, Bob? Have you noticed there's a change?
I think there's two changes. The one that you described, for sure, that they are much more guarded, and Scott said it, exactly the case, that we don't think, that any time you're in an unguarded moment that it's very, there's more risk than there is reward there. So they don't really like that, and no one really wanted the debates. Spanberger did agree to some other debates, but the first debate they usually have early on with the Virginia Bar Association, they didn't even answer the request. I mean, they just blew it off. So you're seeing a little bit of that go on as well. The other thing that's happened, I think, is that there's not as much media.
Right.
So you used to have campaigns where they were followed by the gaggle wherever they went every day. There were 20, 25 people. They were competing for stories. Everybody was trying to get a different angle. And so at the same time, there's much more social media now and far less sort of conventional media. And that has really, I think, also changed the nature of the campaign, because you don't have the whole Capitol press corps following them around like they used to every moment of every day. One can't imagine the kind of movie that they made about Chuck Robb's campaign, The Perfect Candidate, ever occur again, because the media is not following somebody around across Virginia.
Yeah. That's true, although their schedule's a little more guarded than they used to be too. Mark, is there consequence for voters, do you think, or?
Oh, I think there's a big consequence, and Bob has it exactly right. This is a tragedy for our democracy, the decline of traditional media and the loss of mainstream traditional media, particularly in local and state coverage. So we don't have candidates having to be held quite as much accountable by an independent media that they need to get their message out, when they can rely upon social media, podcasts, ideological cable shows, and the like. There are many more vehicles for them to get their message out on their own terms and not have to be accountable by an independent, nonpartisan media as it used to be. And that has really fundamentally changed the nature of how campaigns are conducted now.
I want to quickly touch on something that we saw for the first time in this campaign, and that was what John Reed did. He frustrated by the fact that he could not get a debate with his opponent, so they created the AI debate. And not sure how many people saw it, but he had his staff come up with the answers that he thought the Ghazala Hashmi would give to a list of questions. I mean, was that a clever tactic to use, or did it kind of border on maybe dangerous misrepresentation? Either one of you want to comment?
I thought it made him look desperate. It was silly, quite frankly. I would not advise any campaign to ever do anything like that. The tragedy is there wasn't a real debate. That's the real issue. Now, his opponent perhaps felt that she had no political incentive to have a debate. And again, the lack of a very strong independent media that's following the campaigns, holding them accountable, when are you going to debate? It's not there. One gubernatorial debate, that's all.
Bob, you and I have talked about this too. Again, nature of these campaigns. We can remember the time when a gubernatorial candidate would have point-by-point policy positions on their website. These were really broad themes in both of these campaigns. I mean, what do you make of that? I mean, again, they didn't suffer from it.
Well, I think Spanberger wasn't contested on it. I mean, I think that she was on the exact right territory the impact of Donald Trump on Virginia, and then secondly, the cost of living. And she said she was going to lower costs. And she basically spoke about three major places. Healthcare, she said she's going to lower costs. She was going to lower costs on electric bills, and she was going to lower costs on housing. Then when you look at the plan, I think it's hard to say that anything there is going to definitely lower a consumer's costs tomorrow. But the problem is she wasn't contested by Winsome Earl Sears. Right. She was out there talking about, trans kids in sports, trans kids in bathrooms, and at no point did we have a serious engagement, which you would expect a Republican to do, on energy policy or housing policy or what's going to happen in healthcare, and how are you going to actually lower costs. And so my sense is that now Spanberger will have to deliver on that, but she was smart to do what she did, and at no point was she pressed by her opponent to actually specify anything that was going to lower the cost of somebody at the kitchen table, as they like to say, tomorrow.
Perfect segue to what I want to talk about next as we start to look forward. Right. And it's one thing to win this convincing victory. Now she has to govern. And the things that Bob just mentioned, lowering the cost of electricity, creating more housing. What is she going to need to demonstrate, let's say in this first year in conjunction with the General Assembly, to convince voters that she is delivering on what she promised?
Well, she has to focus on those core issues that were the focus of her campaign. If there is any mandate at all for her election, the issues that Bob just mentioned, right, the affordability issue and the like, these are really hard things to do, by the way. And I'm not exactly sure what she is going to do to make a difference in those areas. But the political challenge for the Democrats is, with the big numbers they have now in the General Assembly, partisan majorities in both houses and having the top three positions, they own it at this point. They own all of it. And that's always very tricky business, right? Because if the voters don't see delivery on those promises, real impact on cost of living, prices and the like, which is really hard to do they then blame the incumbents for not having delivered on their promises? I suppose there's a lot they could do about regulating different businesses or the like, regulating different enterprises, energy, getting into the healthcare exchanges and the like. But beyond that, I'm not really sure what they can affect in the short term.
Bob, it's a tall order.
Yeah, it is. I think you can see on energy the Democrats coalescing around a policy of trying to ensure that residential customers and data centers, for example, pay very differential rates, and that's something that people can understand. She wants to talk about sort of reducing the impact and the importance of pharmacy benefit managers. I'm not sure people know that too much, but that's kind of where she is on that. Housing and getting more housing supply is not something that's going to happen overnight as well. The other thing that I think is going to be a challenge that's interesting to me is that her instincts are, as she said, to be pragmatic, not partisan. If, however, this redistricting proposal is on the ballot in 3 months, that is going to take an awful lot of the oxygen up politically, and it's going to entice all kinds of national money back into Virginia for 3 months to battle this, because this is incredibly important to Hakeem Jeffries, Donald Trump, Speaker Johnson, and they will be all over Virginia on this. And so this is not a fight I think she wants, but it's going to be a fight that the Democrats expect her to lead.
Yeah, you and I have talked about this. You think she is going to have to be a cheerleader for that, whether or not it distracts from, what her main mission is.
It's a challenge. She's going to have to walk and chew gum at the same time, because she has her first, legislative session as well right here. And that's not going to be a picnic either, because where the economy may be going could be much tougher for her than it has been for Youngkin. But at the same time, this is a huge national issue right now, pressed by Hakeem Jeffries, responded with the courts, and it's going. I think from her perspective, maybe if the courts delay it, that might even be better for her right now than have to be there. But people looked at Newsom and what he did, and that has catapulted him nationally. And rightfully or wrongfully, they're going to expect Spanberger to be out in front of this as well.
Mark, the other thing voters are going to be expecting of Abigail Spanberger is to push back against Donald Trump's policies. What are the ways you expect to see her show her resistance? We've seen one already this week, the letter she fired off to the UVA Board of Visitors saying, stand down on appointing a new president, wait until I fill out the board with my appointees. And I actually have an audience question on that front too. What does the governor-elect intend to do about the lawsuits against George Mason? So where do you see her demonstrating pushback and resistance?
Yeah, and I think she has to be careful because she doesn't want to, at the outset, put a bullet target on her back with the current administration in Washington. She's going to have to, if she is really as pragmatic as she says she is, find ways to work with the administration in Washington. And so getting into a back and forth with them on some really divisive issues could ultimately backfire for her. So I would urge some degree of caution, even though the temptation is, and certainly the Democratic base wants the state governor to take precipitous action to go against the Trump administration. I think she can handle a lot of that rhetorically, but without getting into a lot of policy specifics in a way that would pit the new gubernatorial administration against the administration in Washington. But certainly that was a signal, right, that on some issues already early in the transition period, she plans to take a strong posture in defense of the public universities in Virginia, which are perceived by much of the public to be under attack at this time.
Yeah, so I'll talk first about UVA, which I think is going to go forward. I think it's hard for me to imagine that the board will not listen to her.
Yeah.
And because I can't imagine anyone wanting to take that presidency with the incoming governor making that kind of official statement. And that board has basically blown off the legislature on numerous times. Don Scott said he didn't want them to go through with it. Scott Surreyville is in court with them about who's actually even on the board there. And Cree Deeds tried to get some accounting of what happened with Jim Ryan, and they blew him off. They said no. So she has said, she doesn't want the presidency to go, but she's going to have another choice, and that is whether she is going to keep on the board or ask the current chair and vice chair of the rector of that board to leave because of either misfeasance or malfeasance or whatever. So that's one choice she's going to have to make. And then I think the legislature is just furious with what's happening with what the what Congress is now doing to President Washington, and they're going to expect her to stand up for GMU as well. And then finally, I might add, I think I agree with Mark. It's not her instinct to want to pick a fight with President Trump, but it is Jay Jones's campaign.
His job, too.
That's what he's going to do. He's told us he's going to take them to court. He said that right away that's how he won. On the grounds that he would stand up to Trump and he would not be kowtowing to Trump. And so if he's going to deliver on his campaign promises, we're going to see the Attorney General sign on to most of the Democratic lawsuits against the president. And that, again, may not be on top of Spanberger's bingo card, but she's going to have to deal with it.
But that'll give her some coverage, too. Yeah, let him do it.
Yeah, he'll be the front man on that. Let's turn to the General Assembly. And, Mark, you wrote a great column on this week. It can be argued that the Democrats, in some places, overplayed their hand when they had the 10-seat majority that they won in the House in 2019. This time, Don Scott and Dan Helmer, who orchestrated this majority, they said in their press conference the day after the election, they talked about bold ideas, but they also talked about using restraint. So what's your expectation of what that is going to look like and whether they've learned some lessons from what happened then?
Yeah, and that was the point of my column, that the Democrats, having won big elections during Donald Trump's first presidential term, may have misread their mandate as an affirmation for all their liberal progressive ideas that they pushed very aggressively in the General Assembly. And perhaps the 2021 election was a lesson about misreading your mandate, pushing a little too far and causing a political backlash, which I think did happen. And so there's always a temptation in campaigns to think we want a huge majority and we picked up a large number of seats in the General Assembly. This is a positive affirmation for all the great ideas that we campaigned on in the campaign, when in fact the voters are mad about the Trump presidency, they're anxious about the state of the economy, the cuts to the federal government, the DOGE cuts and the like. It wasn't exactly a mandate for everything that the Democrats were campaigning on. And as we've been talking about, it was in many ways an issues-thin campaign on a lot of fronts. And so I'm not quite sure what the mandate would really represent. So I think Spanberger kind of hit the right moment, actually, running as someone who projects this image as a pragmatic centrist who wants to fix problems and get things done without a lot of drama. And I think people are just tired of the drama and the chaos. And she's the exact opposite of that, and people responded to it. But that's not a positive affirmation for this or that public policy idea.
Well, they used the term mandate in that press conference, but...
Well, you know, what's interesting to me as well is how does she get along being really a newcomer to state government with the people who are here permanently, i.e. the General Assembly. And I was struck by an article that Michael Martz did in the Times-Dispatch about the three comments from the leaders. Scott Somerville said, I hope she's not like Youngkin. Don Scott said, well, we're all Democrats, but it's not going to be hunky-dory. And the inimitable Louise Lucas said, you know, I didn't support her for 6 months. I did come around, and I hope she has her listening ear on. So this is going to be, you know, interesting to watch how she kind of negotiates with an assembly who understands that it's a 4-year governorship, and they have their priorities. And it will be interesting to see how many of the 400 bills that Glenn Youngkin vetoed that they bring up.
Wow.
What I saw on the restraint might have been a very specific issue, and maybe I'm reading into that. I think Don Scott might have meant two things. One, to the new people, take it easy. Or he might have meant something about right to work, because that's a big issue in the Virginia business community. Every time I talk to a business group today and of last week, that's all they're talking about. You know, is they're going to protect right to work. And that is a big deal to the business community. And I was thinking that maybe Don Scott was saying, you know, we'll do, you know, the minimum wage, we'll do paid family leave, we'll do collective bargaining for public employees, but we're not going to just go and do that one thing that will all of a sudden make it more difficult for us to raise a lot of money and could have an impact on the business rating in Virginia. And Spanberger has already said she would prefer not to be given that bill. She might support a reform, but she wouldn't support elimination. That's what I read out of Don Scott's comment.
Great points. What about Republicans? Obviously, the first thing they're going to do is try to make a stand against the redistricting constitutional amendment, but what's going to be the role of Republicans in this General Assembly?
Well, their numbers are so thin, they're not going to have any power.
In the House, for sure. Yeah.
I mean, they could put up, you know, a bunch of brochure bills, things that they can run on in 2027 and set up a bunch of issues for the next election cycle at this point. But as far as getting anything done legislatively, I don't see any path for the Republicans at all, given their numbers.
You know, there used to be more centrist Democrats, conservative Democrats in the Senate. When you had Chap Peterson or Linwood Lewis, you had a set of people who weren't always Joe Morrissey, you know, who weren't always dependable on the Democratic side. I think they have more dependable Democrats now for the most part, and so they can probably do what they want to do for the most part on that front as well. But still, I think, you know, here's a person who has never been in Virginia state government, who has to now come and govern, and it'll be fascinating to watch how she operates this, who she brings in, and what kind of Virginia hands does she bring in compared to people that she's familiar with from the federal side.
So what lessons will be taken away from this for the 2026 midterms in Virginia's congressional races? How does this inform them?
Are we going to have maybe one congressional race that's competitive, the second, right?
Well, it depends what happens
see
to
what the map looks
redistricting.
like.
Oh, yeah, well,
Yeah,
yeah, of
that's
course.
right.
Yeah.
But Bob, what do you
Sorry.
think? What do you think the candidates are going to be,
I mean,
looking at in this?
I think they're looking at the same. They're going to be looking at what Spanberger did and what happened nationally, and people who were able to appeal to voters on these, clear pocketbook issues while criticizing Donald Trump are successful, and they were successful regardless of their ideology in some ways. You had Spanberger and Mikey Sherrill, and then you had Zohan Mandami with almost the same message in some fashion. From very different political perspectives. I think you're going to see that again on the Democratic side. I think the Republicans will have to contest the economic issue. They just can't give that away. And their challenge is what happens on the health care issue, I think, because that to me is the real ticking time bomb for them, with people having these excess increases in their ACA, and then Medicaid getting ready to go that year later. It's going to be a tougher environment for Republicans. The second, and if we don't have the redistricting, the Democrats, I think, are also going to try to make a run at the first district with Rob Whitman.
Right.
We've already seen Shannon Taylor, who just lost to Jay Jones by a 1.5 in the primary. She's announced that she wants to run, and there's a whole bevy of people getting ready to do that. So we'll see what happens there.
And Mark, is what happened in Virginia any kind of model nationally again in 2026?
I always caution against overreading the impact of local and state elections as in any way indicative of what's going to happen nationally. Nonetheless, Bob is right. Candidates in different parts of the country, even though running from different ideological wings of the Democratic Party, still focused on affordability, cost of living, housing, things that really matter to voters on a day-to-day basis. So clearly there are lessons there to stick to the fundamentals, and I think this election showed that people were looking for candidates who have answers to the issues that they're most concerned about and are willing to address them. And all of the ideological posturing, the chaos, the drama that we've been going through just isn't motivating voters right now. So candidates next year, I think, can take a lesson there at least.
So Senator Mark Warner is also going to be on the ballot next fall. What does his no vote on ending the shutdown tell you about the approach he's going to take?
Well, I think he understands where the emotional energy is inside the Democratic Party. I'm a little bit cynical about that whole thing. I tend to believe that there was almost an agreement that Tim Kaine would, take the hit and be the 60th vote. He's not up for re-election. He's pretty good at defending himself in public. And Mark Warner can continue to criticize Donald Trump. He can still appeal to the base, and he has a pretty wide range of support. I think a year and a half ago, you would have thought that Glenn Youngkin would have a chance to run against him and be successful. Youngkin's great on television. He's a good campaigner. He's still relatively positive in terms of the approval rating. But I think when he fully embraced the DOGE cuts, it told me that his aspirations are not Virginia-centric any longer.
Yeah, you're setting me up for my next segue, because that's where I was going next to talk about Glenn Youngkin. For what it's worth, Steve Bannon has declared Governor Youngkin's presidential aspirations ended by the results in this Virginia election, by the GOP defeats here. But that seems to me possibly to be an overstatement as well. But Mark, how much damage has been done to him and his presidential aspirations?
Well, I think his brand has been damaged politically. If you look at the course of his governorship, where he tried to improve the Republican Party's fortunes here and there, he doesn't really have much that he can point to. The 2023 elections, he went out there and staked the elections on his abortion plan, right? That really backfired, and the Democrats ended up pushing back on his objective of trying to get partisan Republican majorities in the General Assembly. And this election cycle was a huge repudiation at a time when Earl Sears was running at the end of the campaign a, stay the course kind of message with the Youngkin administration. So I don't see a lot politically that he can point to right now that is going to make a really good case for him to run a national campaign. I don't see it. Yeah.
Bob, let me ask you about Jason Miyares. He's made it clear he's not finished. He wrote "See you on the trail ahead." What do you see as a likely path for him?
I think he clearly is thinking about running for governor next time. And I think if you look at the Republican campaigns, he comes out the best. Right. Even though he lost, he was an impressive candidate. Anyone who watched that debate has to say that he was pretty masterful, I think, as a debater. The evening when he lost, he gave another, I thought, wonderful speech. He's really gotten better in public, I think, than when he first came here. He's pretty seasoned. He knows what to do. I think he has the support of people like George Allen and the business community much more than Winsome Earl Sears would. So I think if you're looking at a Republican bench right now, which is pretty thin, unless you go really outside of it and get a newcomer like you had with Glenn Youngkin, Miyares looks to me to be in a pretty good position. And I don't think he was too damaged by this loss, because I think you have to lay it at the hands of both Trump and the most miserable gubernatorial candidate I've seen in 40 years from Earl Sears.
Mark, agree that he can rebound then pretty well, but there's a big time span between 4 years.
He's a young guy. Bob's analysis is absolutely on target. He's a very talented candidate, and he was smart not to get into the gubernatorial campaign. It's not clear he would have gotten the nomination, and if he did, we wouldn't be talking about his political future so much right now in what turned out to be a wipeout election cycle for the Republicans. Maybe he could have held down their losses a little bit in relationship to the actual outcome in this election cycle, but that would not be much of a bragging point for running again in 4 years. So I think for himself, he did absolutely the right thing.
Who else do you see, Bob, coming off the bench in either party 4 years from now?
Don Scott, if he wants to. That I think he has one of the most remarkable rises that I've ever seen in American politics. Here's a person who spent 9 years in jail, gets his rights restored by Bob McDonnell, passes the bar, 4 years later gets elected to the House, a few years after that orchestrates a coup and becomes the leader of the Democratic Party. Then he orchestrates this campaign, 13 targets on Republicans. They win all the pitches, a perfect game. Raises money that was just inconceivable. In most of these competitive House elections, the Democrats outspent Republicans not 2-1, but often 3-1 and 4-1. He just seems to me to be an absolute star, and that if he wants to leave the speakership and has an aspiration to culminate his career as governor, he's going to be very tough to beat in the Democratic Party right now.
How about another Congress member like Spanberger did? McClellan, Vindman?
I mean, that's possible, I think. But beating Don Scott, I don't think I'd want to run against him.
And the fundraising prowess, you're probably right about that. So same last question for you guys that I had for the first panel, and it comes in part from somebody in the audience. Virginia, blue state, but finer point on that, will demographics lead Virginia to becoming a blue state beyond 2026? So kind of a two-parter there. Where do we stand now? And do demographics push us deeper in that direction?
Right. So I've heard the argument before that demographic change is destiny and it assures a permanent Democratic Party majority because the population changes in Virginia, which have happened very rapidly and pushed it increasingly in the direction of what will become a majority-minority population state in a few or several years. But that analysis always falls short because it presumes that certain groups of voters are static in their voting behavior. And we saw what happened in 2024 with how well Donald Trump did with certain groups of minority voters. So don't assume that demographic change assures a positive future for Democrats in Virginia. They still have to work hard to get those voters. They cannot take them for granted.
Bob, are you declaring it blue or purple?
Purple. I'm sorry.
You're purple.
I'm going.
I think we have a bluish tint for sure. And I think a lot of it actually depends on the evolution of the Republican Party. If the Republican Party is a MAGA party, it won't win a race in Virginia again on that front. Glenn Youngkin, when he ran in 2021, was MAGA light and sort of became full MAGA by 2025. And then he also had a unique issue the parents matter.
Right.
And I don't think it was about trans kids. I think it was about 18 months of remote learning and parents
And the tailwind of COVID.
in a really foul mood. And he won by 2 points. So I think it's an uphill climb for Republicans. They can do it, but I don't think a Republican Party that's attached at the, that cannot bring themselves to criticize Donald Trump, that prefers to lose 30 seats in the House over 8 years and then blame other people, that if they still are full MAGA, I think Virginia Democrats are going to coast for quite some time.
Great observations. Thanks so much to both of you. That is all the time we have this evening. I want to thank all our panelists, our first panel, Scott Weldon and Signori, Samson Signori, and Dr. Mark Rozell, Dr. Bob Holsworth. We also want to thank our producing sponsor, the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, our signature sponsor, Walmart, and the many companies and individuals who support VPAP and make all its wonderful work possible. Thanks for joining us, and good evening.